I'd like to call attention to something that I get asked a fair bit, both in my day-to-day life and also on YouTube, which is what's the best way to cut suspension springs? Should you use an angle grinder? Or maybe you should just use an oxy and heat it up. That'll have the same effect, it'll lower the car. It used to be pretty common at some point in time to get out the oxy and, you just heat up the coils. Well, the thing's, got some weight, it'll collapse in on itself. Well, the first thing you have to be aware of is that it may not be very cool to have a car that's sort of yay high from the wheel to the guard clearance, but at least it's legal. This is actually off an Astra, this strut assembly. It's waiting to go to the scrapyard, but my wife hasn't had a day off from work yet because she loves going to the scrap for some reason. I understand, but anyway, basically, if you cut your springs, it's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. Also, heating up the springs is illegal too. Also, very illegal. It's an offence. Okay, you could end up with a defect, or we call them canaries, because they're basically they stick a like a label sort of on the inside of your car that's yay sort of big, and it says defective vehicle, do not drive, blah blah blah, and it's like 3 demerit points, whatever, $100 fine. But it's also really dangerous. Illegally modifying your suspension system is really stupid. I mean, the other thing is if you go shortening the springs to get lower ground clearance, you're going to make it handle like crap. And there's no shortage in this town of cars that are like this Commodore bouncing down the road because someone chopped a coil out of the springs or something. Obviously these, you can't cut the springs on these Astras because they're like a variable rate spring and the coils are all different diameters. But nevertheless, the only way to do it is to do what I did basically. If you want to lower your car, the only way to do it is to get shockers and springs that are meant to be in the same combination. You probably won't see anything because it's dark, but this is quite a bit lower than the other car. It's actually only 30mm lower than standard, but it's 3 centimeters between here and the tyre different. You can't see the springs and they're all dirty, but they're actually they're King springs. There, you can just make out the yellow in there. The shock absorbers I'm using are reduced travel shock absorbers, front and rear. Obviously it's a McPherson strut front end, so they're short travel struts and shocks basically. Struts are shocks, but not all shocks are struts, okay? Google McPherson strut. You know what I mean? Showed you one just before. But it's expensive to do it this way. It costs money. Basically, the shocks are expensive and the springs are expensive, and if you go on eBay, you'll get it a good bit cheaper than going to Repco or Autobahn or whatever. I mean, I paid, I think it was $650 or something for the springs and the shocks. They come with a 5-year, I don't know, I can't remember what the kilometre warranty is, but the shocks are like 5-year, 120,000 K or 150,000 K or something warranty. They're made in Australia at least. You can buy cheaper struts and shocks that are reduced travel, but I really, honestly, would rather leave a car standard and not modify it if you're going to use cheap stuff. Second-hand shock absorbers are a bad idea as well because they're probably not got lots of life left in them and they're a pain to fit. But if you can do the job yourself, or you can find someone to do it cheaply, it can be worth doing it. But if you get a car that's been lowered properly and the bits are not old, springs is okay, but shock absorbers, if you're going to use second-hand springs, use new shock absorbers at least. But it's tight. This thing handles extremely well. It looks terrible, but it's, this is tight. The other thing you should be aware of is you're going to have to replace your strut mounting bushes and strut bearings. Now, if I go to the struts that are out of the Astra, this is a strut mounting bush. That's what, basically, that sits under this plate here. Okay, this big black plate, this assembly here. So that's what sits on the underside of the strut tower. This threaded bit you can see here is actually this part here. And you can see on this car it's a good bit bigger than the Astra. You'd expect that, wouldn't you? So that's the strut retaining plate basically. So when the suspension, say if you go over a big dip, it basically stops the strut falling out. The dangers of cutting springs are the fact that you're not actually making them harder, partly. The other thing is, if you cut your springs and you're using standard shock absorbers, actually this applies to using lowered, properly lowered springs like what I've got, but using standard shock absorbers too, because if you use a shorter spring, you've got to use shorter travel shocks. Otherwise, when the suspension is at its fully extended position, like this is here, the spring can fall out because the spring doesn't put enough pressure on the strut assembly to hold it in. This is, by the way, this strut's obviously stuffed, and so is that one. That's got an oil leak through this double lip seal. But I digress. You can buy Nolithane brand, or there's other different brands of polyurethane bushers. Every time you change shock absorbers, you should be changing these bushers. There's actually a ball bearing, like a ball bearing or needle roller bearing underneath this assembly. I don't know if I can get it to turn around by hand. I don't know what these are like, but yeah, they're a bit sad. But anyway, your strut bearings and your mounts should be changed every time the strut bearings are going to be stuffed, basically. But you're better off to spend the money to do it properly than you are to do it illegally, because apart from the fact that they are illegal, they handle like crap when they're done incorrectly. If you use polyurethane strut mount bushers, they're a good bit harder than these rubber ones, and it will harden up the ride of the car quite significantly. I mean, my car, you can't exactly feel a postage stamp when you run over it, but I tell you what, you feel every single bump in the road. Also keep in mind that lowered springs are actually a lot harder than standard. They're 40% harder than a standard spring, because you're trying to absorb the same amount of energy every time you go over a bump with a lot less spring travel, so it has to be harder. Spring coils might be slightly thicker, or the spring steel used might be harder. But if I put this camera down, maybe I can demonstrate just how hard this suspension is compared to standard. I don't know if it'll turn out, but zoom in a bit. Let's try it. You have to bear with me for a sec, because not often I do this, but okay, well, this is a standard the lowered VS Commodore suspension. Not a lot of give in that. You can see that it's quite hard. If I go to this thing, this is standard. Zoom out instead of in. That'd help. Right, let's put this down somewhere, theoretically where it's going to be a good shot. Alright, let's put this camera down here. This is the standard VS Commodore suspension. This is quite a lot softer, I'm not pushing it real hard because I don't want this bonnet to fall on my head. But you can see it's quite a lot softer. I don't have to put much effort into removing that. So that's a large part of why a lowered car handles better, because the springs are usually harder than a standard spring. Nolithane bushers do help a car handle. It will maintain geometry better than a rubber bushing, or bush if you want to call it that, because these locate the top of the strut in every direction basically. So they locate the top of the strut. So obviously if you have a harder bush, well, the strut's going to stay more geometrically stable, so this is going to want to move around a lot less. But it does make the ride harder, and not everybody likes that. That VS Commodore's Nolithane, except for the upper control arm bushers on the back. So yeah, it's worth doing it properly, but if you have to manoeuvre around a kangaroo or something, or a cow on the road, I'll tell you what, if you've lowered your car illegally and incorrectly, you're probably going to die if you're going fast enough, because they don't handle well enough to manoeuvre. illegally lowering a car or modifying suspension so it's got a lower ground clearance, it's actually going to make it handle worse than standard. So I'd rather drive a standard car than an illegally lowered car. You know, people complain about getting defects from the cops, but I tell you what, if you've illegally lowered that thing, you deserve every single bit of that canary and fine you get. Because I don't want to be on the road with you, to be honest. So just keep it in mind. You're better off to save up, do it properly, than you are to actually just do it illegally.